All right, strap in, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into modern Indian history.
Sounds intense.
Yeah, well, our listener wants the key insights from this stack of excerpts from Spectrum Modern India.
Ah, classics.
Right. But they don't want to feel like they're back in a lecture hall, so...
We gotta keep things lively.
Exactly. We'll hit those highlights, but also unearth some...
Surprising little details, stuff you might not find in your typical textbook.
Oh, absolutely. Now, I always find it helpful to set the scene. India before British rule. What's the vibe?
It's key to understanding everything that comes after. You gotta picture this. It's the 18th century. The Mughal Empire, once this massive force, is fragmenting.
Crumbling, yeah.
And all these regional players see an opening. Hyderabad, Bengal, Awadh, Mysore, the Marathas, each with their own ambitions and rivalries.
So it's already a powder keg even before the British show up.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
And that's where the British East India Company steps in. This is where things get really...
Interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. At first, they're just traders, right?
Yeah.
Setting up those factories, securing trade deals.
The British East India Company.
Yeah.
Came for the spices, stayed for the... Oh, well.
The entire subcontinent, right. It's a classic story. They realized that to really gain power, they had to get involved in local politics.
Play the game.
Exactly. Backing one ruler against another, manipulating situations to their advantage, and their influence just grows and grows.
Speaking of influence, the source mentions these Farmans of 1717. What's the deal with those?
Those were pivotal. The Mughal emperor, Farrukhsiyar, issued these royal decrees, right? Granting the company all these trading privileges, tax breaks, prime locations. Think Bengal, Gujarat, Hyderabad.
Senate deals.
Yeah, some historians even call them the Magna Carta of the East India Company. They really paved the way for their economic dominance.
Wow, so it was a mix of strategy, opportunity, and maybe a few lucky breaks that helped them gain a foothold.
But don't think for a second that everyone just rolled over. Indian history is full of resistance, rebellion. And what's really interesting is how these uprisings were tied to traditional social structures and economic grievances.
I can see that. People fighting for their way of life.
Exactly. Take the Polygar Rebellion in South India. These local chiefs, the Polygars, they were among the first to envision this mass movement against British rule.
Wow, so they saw early on that unity was key to challenging this new power. The source also talks about the Santal Rebellion of 1855. What was the driving force behind that one?
The Santals, a tribal group, were facing brutal economic exploitation, land taken away, crushing taxes, forced labor, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds awful.
It was. Their rebellion, it was this cry for a return to a golden age, a time of freedom and self-sufficiency.
This yearning for a better past.
Right. So we see this pattern, resistance, fueled by this deep connection to their traditional way of life and this burning desire for economic justice. It's a powerful combination.
Powerful and understandable. Makes you wonder what made the British think they could just, I don't know, waltz in and take over.
Well, they had the military might, of course. But they also underestimated the simmering resentment, and all that resentment finally explodes in 1857, the year that shook the very foundation of British rule, the Great Uprising.
Oh, yes, the so-called Sepoy Mutiny. But it was so much more than just a mutiny, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was years of grievances, of cultural misunderstandings finally boiling over. And the incident that lit the fuse, the infamous greased cartridges, it perfectly captured the deep sense of disrespect that was fueling the uprising.
Remind me about those cartridges.
Okay, so the new Enfield rifles, they use these cartridges, right? Rumors spread that they were greased with animal fat, a huge no-no for both Hindu and Muslim sepoys.
I could see why that would cause a problem.
Oh, it was a huge violation. Whether true or not, the perception was that it was a deliberate attempt to defile their faith, a symbol of British disregard for their traditions.
It was the spark that ignited the powder keg.
Exactly. And suddenly, sepoys are rebelling, civilians are joining in, and this wave of unrest just sweeps across northern India. Even Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, gets pulled in.
Wait, the Mughal emperor? I thought they were out of the picture by this point.
He was more of a figurehead then, under British control. At first he hesitated, he was old, didn't want to risk what little power he had left.
But ultimately he became a rallying point for the rebels.
Yeah, his participation, even if reluctant, gave the uprising a sense of legitimacy, united different groups under this banner of restoring Mughal rule. It was a powerful symbol.
Tragically, we know the rebellion was eventually crushed. What were the main factors that led to its defeat?
Well, the British had superior resources, better organization, that's a given. But they also played on divisions within India, classic divide and rule. Some rulers, afraid of losing their own power, sided with the British. and the British were masters of manipulating religious and regional differences.
So it was a combination of brute force and cunning politics that led to the end of the uprising.
Sadly, yes. But this wasn't the end of the story. The 1857 revolt was a turning point. It sparked this new sense of national consciousness, a realization that the fight for freedom had to be more organized, more strategic.
A wake-up call, in a way.
Absolutely. And from the ashes of that rebellion rose this new generation of leaders, thinkers, determined to find a way to a free India.
Okay, so this is where figures like Dadahai Naoroji come into play. His drain theory, what was that all about?
Nauroji was brilliant. He meticulously documented how British policies were bleeding India dry, transferring its wealth to Britain. His work exposed the economic exploitation at the heart of colonial rule.
He connected the dots.
Yeah, he showed the cost of colonialism. Then you have figures like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who understood the power of the people, how to mobilize the masses.
And Tilak was all about Swaraj, self-rule.
Oh, he was a master at using cultural symbols, festivals to connect with everyday Indians. He framed Swaraj as their birthright, not some gift from the British.
Powerful message. And this is also the time when the Indian National Congress emerges, right?
Right. Founded in 1885. Initially, they were more about working within the system, pushing for reforms.
But the tide was turning, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The demand for complete independence was getting louder, and even the Congress had to recognize that shift.
And then you have the Swadeshi movement kicking off in 1905. What was that all about?
That was huge. It was a direct response to the partition of Bengal, and it marked this shift from talking to action. Indians started boycotting British goods, embracing Indian-made products.
Some statement, for sure.
It was a statement of self-reliance, of resistance, and it wasn't just about economics. It had this cultural ripple effect. You see this explosion of Indian art, music, literature, even fashion. People were rediscovering their own heritage, expressing their national pride in new ways.
It's amazing how something like partitioning Bengal, a seemingly administrative move, could ignite such a powerful wave of national sentiment.
The British underestimated the emotional connection Indians felt to their land, their culture. They also failed to grasp the unifying force of this shared struggle against their rule.
So their attempt to weaken the nationalist movement by dividing Bengal actually backfired.
Big time. It was a major turning point. The desire for freedom was burning brighter than ever. But the British weren't about to give up, not without a fight. They tried to appease the moderates with reforms, like the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, expanding legislative councils, giving Indians more say, at least on paper.
Sounds promising. But I'm guessing there was a catch.
There always is, right? They also introduced separate electorates for Muslims, again, trying to divide and rule. They hoped to drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims, weaken the nationalist movement.
Classic tactic. But did it work?
Not really. The momentum was too strong. The desire for freedom was too deeply rooted. It was only a matter of time before India would claim its rightful place as an independent nation.
And that journey toward independence takes an even more dramatic turn with the arrival of Mahatma Gandhi.
No, that's a story.
But we're going to have to save that fascinating chapter for part 2 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned.
In the meantime, think about what we've uncovered so far. What stands out to you as the most crucial development in India before Gandhi's arrival? Hold on to that question as we continue our exploration of modern Indian history.
Welcome back to our deep dive, folks. Picking up where we left off, India in the early 20th century, a real mix of ideas about how to achieve independence.
Yeah, we had those moderates pushing for gradual change within the system, working with the British.
Right. Figures like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, a big advocate for social reform and education. He believed in dialogue, working within the existing framework to gain more autonomy for India.
Dominion status, right.
Exactly. But then you had those on the other end of the spectrum, those who wanted complete independence now.
Extremists.
Right. Folks like Tilak, we talked about him earlier. He was all about complete independence, Swaraj, as India's birthright. And he knew how to get people fired up.
Yeah, he was a master at using those cultural symbols, those festivals, to connect with everyday Indians.
And then, into this already complex situation, walks Mahatma Gandhi.
Talk about a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. But before we get into Gandhi's impact, I'm curious what brought him back to India in the first place.
Yeah, good question. He wasn't born in India, right?
No, he was born in India, but he'd spent years in South Africa fighting for social justice there.
Right, I'd forgotten that.
He developed his whole philosophy of satyagraha there, truth force. It was all about resisting injustice through non-violent means.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So he brings these ideas back to India in 1915.
Yep. And the timing was perfect. World War I was raging, the British Empire was stretched thin, and the nationalist movement in India was gaining momentum.
People were ready for a leader.
And Gandhi, with his message of nonviolence, his commitment to truth and justice, he really embodied those aspirations.
Okay, so let's talk about this whole concept of satyagraha. It sounds, I don't know, almost spiritual.
It is, in a way, but it's also very practical. It's the belief that truth is the most powerful force, and that you should never resort to violence, even when facing injustice.
Turn the other cheek, kinda?
It's more than that. It's about appealing to the conscience of your oppressor, accepting suffering as a means of purification, of awakening.
So it's not passive at all, it's active resistance.
Exactly. Gandhi believed that true strength came not from physical force, but from moral courage, from the unwavering pursuit of truth. Violence just breeds more violence, he argued. Satyagraha, by refusing to meet aggression with aggression, it breaks that cycle.
It's a radical departure from traditional ways of fighting back.
It was revolutionary. It challenged those in power. It demanded a transformation of the self, a complete faith in the power of truth to overcome injustice. And Gandhi didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk,
Putting those ideas into action.
Right from the start. The Champaran Satyagraha in 1917, his first major campaign in India. He went to Champaran, this rural district, to support indigo farmers who were being exploited by British planters.
The book mentioned that
These farmers were forced to grow indigo, this cash crop, on their land, and the conditions were terrible. Gandhi listened to their grievances, he organized the community, and used nonviolent resistance to get the planters to back down.
So he started small, addressing the everyday struggles of ordinary people.
That was his genius. True self-rule, Swaraj. He believed it had to start from the ground up, empowering people to fight for their rights, to build a just society from the bottom up.
And that resonated with people.
Oh yeah. Champaran, even though it seemed like a small victory, it had a huge impact. It showed people the power of satyagraha, that even the British Empire could be challenged without violence. It gave them hope.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? The road to independence had its share of setbacks.
Definitely. And one of the darkest chapters was the Rowlatt Act and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
Yeah, those were dark days for India. The Rowlatt Act, passed in 1919, basically allowed the British to arrest anyone without trial.
A total violation of civil liberties.
And Gandhi, of course, launched a satyagraha campaign against it.
And the response was huge. People all across India joined in. But the British, they cracked down hard.
Which leads us to April 13th, 1919, and the massacre at Jallianwala
A
Bagh.
day that will never be forgotten. A huge crowd, peaceful protesters gathered in this enclosed garden in Amritsar. Men, women, children.
And General Dyer, this British officer, he orders his troops to open fire on them.
Just like that, no warning, nowhere to escape. Hundreds were killed or wounded. It was a horrific display of colonial brutality.
A turning point for many Indians. The brutality of the massacre shattered any remaining illusions they might have had about British rule.
It fueled the fire for independence, that's for sure. And Gandhi, even in the face of this tragedy, he emerged as this beacon of hope, this symbol of resilience, and he channeled all that grief and anger into a new movement.
The non-cooperation movement.
Launched in 1920, a bold plan. Gandhi called on Indians to withdraw from every aspect of British rule, boycott their courts, their schools, their goods, everything.
A total shutdown.
Exactly, and it worked. Millions joined in. People were burning their British clothes, quitting their jobs, refusing to pay taxes. The jails were overflowing with peaceful protesters. The British administration was in chaos.
Must have felt like a real turning point.
It was. But then, in 1922, there was this incident of violence in Chari Chara. A mob clashed with police, and several policemen were killed.
And that's when Gandhi calls off the entire movement.
He was devastated by the violence. It went against everything he stood for. He felt the movement was losing its moral compass, so he suspended it, much to the disappointment of many who felt victory was within reach.
It must have been a tough call to make, but it shows his commitment to his principles.
He wouldn't compromise on nonviolence, even if it meant delaying independence. That's what made Gandhi so extraordinary. He believed that the means were just as important as the ends. A nation built on violence would be forever tainted, he said.
A powerful message.
And meanwhile, what are the British doing during all of this? They tried everything, repression, reform, anything to hold on to control. They kept trying to exploit religious differences, hoping to divide the nationalist movement from within.
Divide and rule.
But the momentum was with the nationalists. There was no stopping it. And Gandhi's leadership, his unwavering commitment to nonviolence, his ability to mobilize millions, It made him a force to be reckoned with.
But he was a true leader. And his
Uh,
next campaign, the civil disobedience movement, that's where things really escalate.
Oh, yeah. Things are about to get interesting. But we'll have to save that story and the final push for independence for the last part of our deep dive. Stay with us. All right, picking up where we left off India in the 1930s and 40s on the road to independence. But there's this other story unfolding alongside it, the rise of Muslim nationalism, the demand for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier, but can we rewind a bit? What were the main factors that led to this demand for Pakistan?
It's complex, like most things in history. There was this growing sense among some Muslims that their interests, their identity, weren't fully represented in a mostly Hindu India.
They felt marginalized.
Exactly. And this feeling, it was made worse by some of those British policies, like those separate electorates we talked about.
Right. Intended to give Muslims a voice, but ended up driving a wedge between communities.
Exactly. Divide and rule. Classic British strategy. And in this climate, figures like Muhammad Ali Jinnah rise to prominence. He became the leader of the Muslim League and really pushed for this idea of Pakistan.
Jinnah. He's an interesting figure, right?
Oh, absolutely. A brilliant lawyer, charismatic leader. At first, he actually advocated for Hindu-Muslim unity, worked with both Congress and the Muslim League.
So it changed.
Over time, he became disillusioned with Congress, saw it as increasingly dominated by Hindu interests. He came to believe that a separate Muslim state was the only way to protect the rights and future of India's Muslims.
So by the 1940s, the idea of Pakistan, it's gaining real momentum.
Oh, absolutely. In 1940, the Muslim League, under Jinnah's leadership, formally adopted the Pakistan Resolution, a direct challenge to Congress's vision of a united, independent India.
So you have these two competing visions.
Right.
And then throw World War II into the mix.
Talk about a game changer. India is pulled into the war, even though Congress opposed it. And it creates this sense of urgency, you know. The British, they're exhausted, they're ready to grant independence, finally.
But the question is, how? To whom?
Exactly. The stakes were incredibly high, and this is where Lord Mountbatten enters the picture, the last viceroy of India, tasked with overseeing the transition to independence.
Great job.
Understatement. Mountbatten arrives in 1947, and he quickly realizes how tense things are. Communal violence is already breaking out. He sees the writing on the wall.
He sees the partition is inevitable.
He comes to believe it's the only way to prevent a full-scale civil war, as terrible as that is. So the decision to partition India, it's made under immense pressure, this feeling of desperation.
To stop the bloodshed?
Yeah, exactly. But the way it was carried out, it was hasty, ill-planned. They brought in this British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, to draw the boundaries between India and Pakistan.
The Radcliffe Line, the infamous line drawn on a map that divided communities, families, lives.
A line drawn by someone who had never even been to India. The result was chaos, confusion, mass displacement.
Millions of people uprooted, forced to flee their homes.
Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, all caught up in this upheaval, one of the largest mass migrations in history, and the violence that accompanied it was horrific.
A tragic chapter.
Hundreds of thousands, even millions, lost their lives in the communal violence.
A heavy price to pay for freedom.
A reminder of the enduring scars of division. And this is the backdrop against which India and Pakistan finally achieve independence in August of 1947.
A bittersweet victory.
A culmination of decades of struggle, but achieved at a terrible cost. And for newly independent India, there are so many challenges. Integrating princely states, writing a constitution, rebuilding a nation shattered by partition.
It's hard to imagine how they even began to tackle those challenges.
It was a period of immense upheaval, for sure, but also a time of great hope and possibility. India, under Nehru's leadership, embarked on this ambitious project of nation building. Democracy, secularism, a modern socialist state, that was the vision.
And so our deep dive into modern Indian history comes to an end. It's been quite a journey.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? Empires rising and falling, the fight for freedom, the birth of new nations, the power of ideas. We've met fascinating figures along the way, each shaping this vast and intricate story.
It's a story of resilience, of struggle, of triumph and tragedy. And it's not over, is it?
Not by a long shot. India's story continues to unfold, just like all of our stories. What are your takeaways? What surprised you? What will you continue to explore? We hope this deep dive has ignited your curiosity, inspired you to learn more.
Because that's what this is all about, right? Learning from the past, understanding the present, and hopefully building a better future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.